It was January 5th, 1943, a night so ordinary that no one on the USS Helena expected history to tap them on the shoulder. The crew was used to the usual chaos of Pacific skies, sirens wailing, engines roaring, gunners cursing at fast-moving specks that never seemed to fly where they were supposed to. But then a Japanese bomber broke through the clouds, diving in with the confidence of someone who'd survived this dance a dozen times. The Helena's 5-inch guns answered like they always did. Same barrels, same gun crews, same routine. And yet, something was different. The shell didn't miss. It didn't explode too early or too late. It detonated right next to the bomber, like it had politely asked the pilot for his coordinates a moment before blowing the wings off. The crew froze for half a second, staring at the black puff in the sky where a whole aircraft had existed just a heartbeat earlier. Then came the shouting. Someone joked that the gun crew must have made a pact with the devil. Another swore the shell had developed a personal grudge against aircraft. Whatever it was, the Japanese certainly didn't appreciate the upgrade. They just knew their bomb runs suddenly felt like suicide missions. And this was only the first hint. Overnight, Allied anti-aircraft guns started landing hits nobody thought were humanly possible. The enemy had no idea why their planes were dropping like flies. Frankly, most Allied crews didn't either. Same guns, same shells. So how did one tiny change make artillery 50 times deadlier? What exactly did the Allies slip into the nose of those shells, and how did it end up rewriting the rules of modern warfare? Before World War II, artillery wasn't just another branch of the military. It was the grumpy old king sitting on a throne of craters, casually responsible for about 75% of all casualties in the First World War. Soldiers joked that if the bullets didn't get you, the king certainly would, usually at the worst possible moment. And they weren't wrong. Artillery shaped every battle, every advance, every retreat. If infantry were the ones physically walking across the fields, artillery was the invisible hand slapping everything around them. Armies treated it with the reverence of a temperamental god. It had 3 main jobs. First, counter-battery fire. Basically dueling with the enemy's guns and hoping yours could find them before they found you. Considering both sides were doing their math on paper maps while being shelled, it was about as glamorous as it sounds. Then came interdiction, lobbing shells deep behind enemy lines to ruin supply columns, delay reinforcements, and generally make life miserable for anyone who thought they were safe just because they weren't on the front line. And finally, infantry support. The classic, help us soften up that hill before we go up there and get shot role. But for all its reputation, early artillery operated in a way that would make modern gunners cringe. A typical fire mission began with an approximate, emphasis on approximate. Crews pulled out rulers, angle boards, and their best guess at the wind. They fired a salvo, then waited for a forward observer, who was usually freezing in a ditch miles away, to radio back something like, too far left, or a little long, or occasionally, you've just hit a tree, please stop embarrassing us. The whole thing depended on weather, visibility, and luck. Thick fog? Bad. Smoke? Worse. Rain? Just forget it. It worked, but slowly. Painfully slowly. And accuracy was, let's call it, optimistic. Yet even with all these flaws, artillery still reigned supreme. That's how powerful it was. Even when clumsy, it dominated battlefields. So imagine what would happen if someone suddenly made this king, precise, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. The groundwork was already there. Everyone just needed a spark big enough to change everything. Before the big breakthrough arrived, World War II battlefields were already crowded with every type of artillery imaginable, like a very loud family reunion where everyone solves problems by throwing explosives. Field guns were the straight shooters of the bunch, literally, firing low and fast at targets they could more or less see. Howitzers preferred a dramatic arc, lobbing shells over hills and obstacles as if they were showing off. Mortars were the close-range cousins, light enough to follow the infantry and drop rounds almost straight down like angry rain. Then you had anti-aircraft guns, pointing accusing fingers into the sky, and anti-tank guns, which were basically shouting, "Not today," at armored vehicles. And of course, each of these weapons demanded its own kind of ammunition. High explosive rounds were the classic crowd pleasers, simple, loud, effective. Shrapnel shells sprayed steel fragments like confetti at the world's worst parade. Anti-tank rounds were solid, stubborn, and designed to punch holes in metal. Smoke shells created giant billboards in the sky that said, "You can't see me," while illumination shells did the opposite, turning night into an unwanted spotlight. The Japanese, being creatively ruthless, even used gas shells disguised as smoke, proving once again that war brings out some questionable ingenuity. But none of these shells meant anything without one tiny piece screwed into the nose, the fuse. This little component decided when a shell exploded, on impact, after a delay, or in midair. Get it right, and a single round could break an attack. Get it wrong, and you'd waste precious ammunition or blow up nothing but an innocent patch of dirt. Every gun on the battlefield, from the smallest mortar to the biggest naval cannon, depended on that fuse doing exactly what it was told. So before the Allies changed warfare forever, this was the world they lived in. Dozens of guns, dozens of shells, and one tiny device that made or broke the shot. And as it turned out, changing that part was all it took to rewrite the rules. Before the miracle arrived, the old fuse system was already showing its age, and not in a charming, grandfather-telling war stories way. The simplest kind, the point-detonating fuse, did exactly what its name promised. Hit something, explode. Great for smashing bunkers, terrible for hitting a fast-moving aircraft that absolutely refused to sit still and politely wait for impact. Trying to use those against planes was like trying to swat flies with a brick. So the world turned to the time fuse, the so-called smart option of the era. Except smart was generous. Crews had to set the timing by hand, twisting a little dial to guess when the shell should explode in midair. Guessed too early, and it popped harmlessly in the sky like a confused firework. Guessed too late, and it detonated after the plane had already flown past, probably with the pilot laughing on the way out. A few milliseconds off, and your perfect shot became an expensive disappointment burning thousands of feet above the ocean. The Germans were the masters of this tedious craft. Their famous 88mm guns were engineering marvels, deadly against tanks and feared by Allied pilots. But even with brilliant crews, radar guiding them, and mechanical computers helping with the math, they still needed around 3,000 shells to bring down a single bomber. 3,000! That's not efficiency, that's stubbornness with good branding. The fundamental problem was simple. You needed a shell to explode near the aircraft, but you had no way to know exactly when near was. Everything depended on calculations, visibility, and luck. Mostly luck. Some days the gunners hit something, most days they hit clouds, air, or their own patience threshold. By the early 1940s, everyone knew time fuses had reached their limit. The guns were powerful, the crews were skilled, but the sky was changing faster than the technology could keep up. The world needed something new, something that didn't rely on guesswork, hand-twisting, or divine intervention. And that impossible challenge is exactly what paved the way for the fuse that would change everything. Long before Allied gunners got their miracle upgrade, the Germans were already running one of the most intimidating air defense networks the world had ever seen. The night sky split open by searchlights, radar dishes turning like hungry metal predators, and batteries of 88s waiting below, all plugged into a central brain the size of a wardrobe. It looked less like a military system and more like a mad scientist's attempt to turn math into destruction, and honestly, it almost worked. Their radar tracked incoming bombers from miles away, feeding altitude, speed, and direction into mechanical computers, giant gears and levers calculators called Kommandogerät. These things were so precise, they could predict where an aircraft would be 20 seconds into the future, which is already more foresight than most pilots had. The predictions then shot straight to the gun crews, who swung their cannons in perfect unison, like they were performing some deadly choreography. When everything lined up, entire batteries fired at once, sending hundreds of shells arcing into the darkness in a synchronized barrage that must have looked absolutely terrifying from the receiving end. And yet, the results were almost embarrassingly underwhelming. For all that engineering brilliance, all that coordination, all that German efficiency people love to joke about, the system still relied on the same old time-fused guesswork. Radar could tell you where a bomber was, and the mechanical brain could tell you where it should be in a few seconds, but the fuse? The fuse just shrugged and hoped for the best. The shell still had to explode at exactly the right moment, and the right moment was still determined by a hand-set timer that didn't care about your fancy calculations. So even with an entire orchestra of machines playing together, the hit rates were brutally low. Explosions lit up the sky, but most of them burst harmlessly around the bombers, who pushed through the flak fields gritting their teeth and praying. German crews fired thousands of rounds, not because the guns were bad, but because the fuse made the whole system blind at the final, most important second. It was a masterpiece with a fatal flaw, and everyone knew it, even the Germans. They had built a machine that could almost win the duel with Allied bombers, but almost wasn't enough. The hard truth was simple. Without a smarter fuse, all the radar and all the engineering in the world couldn't change the outcome. The ceiling of old technology had been reached, and the next breakthrough was about to shatter it. In the Pacific, the limits of old technology weren't just an inconvenience, they were a death sentence. Allied ships sailed under skies that seemed to spit aircraft at them non-stop, and every one of those planes had a very personal interest in sinking something big, expensive, and preferably American. The fleet's first line of defense, 50 cows, 20mm Oerlikons, 40mm Bofors, did their best, blazing away like angry hornets, but the truth was brutal. It wasn't enough. A fast dive bomber could slip right through that wall of lead with the confidence of someone walking past a sleeping guard dog. So the Americans did the most logical thing you can do in wartime. They added more guns. Then more. Then even more. Some ships looked like floating porcupines bristling with barrels in every direction. But even with dozens, sometimes hundreds of guns per vessel, the math was ugly. A single Japanese squadron could still punch a hole straight through the formation, and the pilots knew every weakness by heart. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, torpedo planes skimmed just above the waves, and then came the new nightmare, kamikazes, pilots who didn't need an escape route because they had already accepted they weren't coming home. For the men on deck, it wasn't some textbook intercept scenario. It was pure survival. You'd see the incoming specs, hear the alarms, feel the ship shake as guns opened up, and still wonder if the next explosion would be yours. Crews talked later about how the sky sometimes looked like an entire fireworks show detonating at once, yet the enemy planes kept coming through, smoking, burning, but still deadly. Every miss wasn't just wasted ammunition, it was another step closer to a stern deck full of shrapnel and fire. By 1942, it was painfully clear the Allies didn't need a bigger gun or a faster reload. They needed something smarter, something that could reach up into the chaos and think for a split second. Because this wasn't theory or engineering pride anymore. This was a race to keep their ships and themselves alive. The idea that would change the entire war didn't begin in some giant American laboratory guarded by soldiers with machine guns. It actually started in Britain, sketched out by engineers who were desperate for any trick that might keep the Luftwaffe from flattening their cities. They imagined a fuse that could sense a target instead of guessing. Not explode on impact, not explode after timer, but explode when it got close enough to matter. It sounded like science fiction in 1940, the kind of thing you'd propose right before your boss asked if you were feeling well. But the Americans looked at those early sketches and didn't laugh. They locked the designs away, stamped everything top secret, and threw some of their best minds at the problem. And that's when the real challenge began. Because putting a tiny radar set inside the nose of a spinning artillery shell was basically equivalent to asking a pocket radio to survive being fired out of a cannon at 20,000 times the force of gravity while spinning like a blender on its worst day. Most early prototypes didn't fail, they simply evaporated on launch. One scientist joked that the only thing the team was reliably producing at first was disappointment. Inside that small metal cap, they needed something that could send out radio waves, listen for the echo bouncing off an aircraft, recognize when the echo changed, and then trigger the detonator at just the right moment, all while spinning at nearly 30,000 revolutions per minute, being roasted by barrel heat, rattled by vibration, and constantly bullied by magnetic fields. The components were tiny, vacuum tubes the size of a fingertip, wires thinner than a hair, and each had to be sealed in resin so the whole thing didn't shake itself to death mid-flight. Even the battery was a marvel, a little glass ampule of electrolyte that stayed inactive until firing shattered it, waking up the fuse like an angry genie. Eventually, after hundreds of failures and enough broken prototypes to fill a museum, the device actually worked. The miniature radar sent out waves during flight, and the moment the shell drifted close to a target, the returning signal shifted just enough to trip the detonator. The shell didn't need to hit the plane, it only needed to get near it. Suddenly, the artillery round itself was thinking faster than any gun crew ever could. And because this little invention was so valuable, the Allies treated it like the crown jewel of the entire war effort. Early orders allowed it to be used only over water, just in case an unexploded shell landed somewhere the enemy could find it. Factories were hidden, shipments were guarded, and the whole project was spoken of with the same level of secrecy as the atomic bomb. No one outside a tiny circle understood exactly what the Americans had just built. But soon, every gun crew in the Pacific and Europe would feel it, because this wasn't just another upgrade. This was the moment artillery stepped into the future, and the enemy would have no idea what hit them. The first real test came on the decks of the USS Helena, and it wasn't even meant to be dramatic. A Japanese bomber came sweeping in low, confident in the same old pattern. Dodge a few bursts of flak, drop its payload, fly home bragging. But this time, when the Helena's 5-inch guns barked, the shell didn't behave like its shy, time-fused ancestors. It climbed, drifted close, too close, and then erupted beside the bomber with the kind of perfect timing that made the gun crew stare at each other like someone had just rewritten the laws of physics. One moment a threatening silhouette, the next moment just smoke and falling metal. The crew stood there stunned, as if waiting for someone to explain how they'd suddenly become sharpshooters. That wasn't luck. That was the first combat kill of a proximity fuse, and it was only the beginning. Overnight, ships equipped with the new rounds started racking up hits so consistently that reports back to command sounded exaggerated. Before, it took thousands of shells to bring down one plane, a depressing equation that every sailor knew too well. Now, the number dropped to around 150 rounds per kill. Not perfect, but compared to the old math, it was like switching from throwing rocks to firing guided missiles. The Japanese noticed. Oh, they noticed. Pilots who had once slipped through flak clouds with ease suddenly found the sky exploding around them instead of behind them. Dive bombers vanished mid-attack. Torpedo planes were ripped apart before they ever got close. Radio operators on ships started hearing panicked chatter from enemy formations. Nobody could figure out how Allied gunners had suddenly turned into fortune tellers with perfect aim. And far from the Pacific, London saw the change too. V-1 flying bombs that once terrorized the city began dropping from the sky in alarming numbers, swatted down before they could reach their targets.
Anti-aircraft crews who used to fire blindly into the night were suddenly scoring hit after hit, watching those buzzing engines sputter out as the drones spiraled to the ground. It felt like the Allies had flipped a switch. One moment they were struggling to survive waves of enemy aircraft, the next they were carving those waves apart with almost casual precision. The war hadn't changed overnight, but the artillery sure had, and the Axis powers had no idea how badly the balance had just shifted against them. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Allies suddenly found themselves blind. Fog hung so thick you could practically taste it, and visibility was so bad that even experienced observers couldn't see more than a few dozen yards ahead. Artillery, the king of the battlefield, was stuck swinging in the dark. And that's when Eisenhower made the call that changed everything. He ordered the proximity fuse to be used on land, secrecy be damned. If the Germans didn't break through, fine. If they did, well, they'd be too busy running to reverse engineer anything. On the German side, infantry marched confidently through the mist. The weather was supposed to protect them. Hidden movement, concealed advances, this was their moment. But the Americans had already loaded their guns with the new VT shells, and when they fired, something terrifying happened. Instead of burying themselves harmlessly in the soft winter ground, the shells burst in midair, right above the advancing troops, each explosion spraying razor-sharp fragments downward like a steel rainstorm. Soldiers who would have survived traditional impact shells suddenly had nowhere to hide. Trenches offered little safety without overhead cover, and open ground became a death zone. Reports from German officers afterwards didn't read like standard after-action notes. They sounded like horror stories. One called it a new art of slaughter. Another described how entire units were shredded before they even understood they were under attack. Men who thought they were safe in fog found that the fog only made them easier targets, their silhouettes standing out perfectly to American gunners who no longer needed eyes on target, just approximate coordinates and a VT fuse that handled the rest. The battlefield itself seemed to turn against the Germans. Every shell that burst overhead lit the gray sky with a harsh white flash, revealing chaos. Scattered helmets, torn equipment, snow melted into muddy craters. Survivors talked about the sound more than anything else. The eerie whistle of a shell passing overhead. A heartbeat of silence, then a detonation suspended above them, exactly where a human gunner could never have placed it. By the end of the Ardennes fighting, the message was clear. The proximity fuse wasn't just a technological upgrade, it was a battlefield nightmare for anyone on the receiving end. And in those frozen woods, under that choking fog, the Germans learned that a tiny device in the nose of a shell could turn the tide of a whole offensive. When the war finally began to tilt toward victory, the sheer scale of what the Allies had built came into focus. By the end, more than 22 million proximity fuses had rolled off assembly lines, most of them produced in such secrecy that workers joked they'd probably built either a miracle or a war-ending disaster, but nobody would tell them which. Entire factories were converted for the project. One plant that used to make Christmas lights had to shut down its holiday business entirely, which meant somewhere in America, a very confused child probably wondered why Santa suddenly hated decorations. Out at sea, the fuse even developed an unintended hobby, blowing up seabirds. Early models were a bit too friendly, detonating when anything wandered close enough. Planes, debris, and, unfortunately, unlucky birds just trying to mind their business. Engineers fixed it eventually, but those first few months probably gave the local wildlife trust issues. And while the war ended, the fuse didn't. Its core idea, detonating when you're close enough, not when the timer says so, became the foundation of modern airburst munitions. Artillery today, from smart shells to guided rockets, still traces its family tree back to that tiny metal nose cone that survived impossible physics and rewrote battlefield tactics. Looking back, it's almost funny.
The Allies didn't build a bigger gun, or a louder gun, or a faster gun. They just made a shell that knew when to explode. And somehow, that one small change reshaped the entire war and everything that followed.